All right, let's get right into it. For years, the U.S. national debt has been this giant, scary number that we see on the news, but it always felt, well, kind of abstract, like someone else's problem for another day. But what if it's not just a number that got out of control? What if it's actually part of a deliberate, if quiet, strategy? We're going to break down how a government can make a mountain of debt just sort of disappear, not by paying it off, but by changing the very nature of the money in your wallet.
$38 trillion. I mean, it's a number so big our brains can't even really picture it. For decades, the thinking was, deficits don't matter. As long as the economy was growing, we could handle it. But that all changed. Interest rates shot up, and suddenly this abstract number woke up and became a very, very real problem.
And this is the moment everything flipped. For the very first time, the U.S. government is now spending more money just on the interest payments for its old debt than it does on the entire national defense budget. Just think about that. More money is going to service past borrowing than to fund the entire military. That's the point where a statistic stops being a statistic and starts becoming a full-blown crisis.
So yeah, this isn't just another line item in the budget anymore. The debt has basically morphed into what some call a predator. It's actively hunting and eating up the federal budget, changing our country's priorities without anyone ever voting for it.
This is the doom loop you hear about, the debt spiral. The government literally has to sell new bonds to get the cash to pay the interest on the old bonds. It's kind of like using a new credit card to pay the minimum balance on your other one. And of course, that just makes the total debt bigger, which means the next interest payment is even larger, which means you have to borrow even more. It's a cycle that feeds on itself.
So how do you get out of a trap like this? Well, traditionally, there are two ways out. But as we're about to see, for a country like the United States, both of these escape hatches are pretty much welded shut.
Okay, on one side, you've got austerity. This would mean huge tax hikes and deep, painful cuts to programs like Social Security and Medicare that millions of people depend on. Politically, that's just a non-starter. It's suicide. Then you have the other option, an outright default. Just stop paying. But U.S. bonds are the bedrock of the entire global financial system. A U.S. default wouldn't just be a crisis, it would be a complete and total meltdown. It's the financial equivalent of the nuclear option.
So, if you can't cut spending, and you can't just walk away from the bill, what's left? What's the third door? What is the path that governments have almost always taken when they find themselves stuck in this exact spot? And this is where we get to the core idea. The third path isn't some big dramatic announcement. It's a slow, quiet, almost invisible process. It's called the silent default.
The soft default means the government pays every single bill on time, down to the penny. The checks don't bounce. But, and this is a huge but, the dollars it uses to pay you back are worth less. They buy less food, less gas, less everything than when you first lent the money. So you're not technically stiffing your creditors, you're just paying them back with cheaper money. And the way you do this, the mechanism, has a fancy name, financial repression. But it's actually a simple concept. Think of it as a hidden tax, specifically on people who save. By making sure that inflation is running just a little bit higher than the interest rates you get on your savings or your bonds, the government guarantees that your savings are losing a tiny bit of purchasing power every single year. Your account balance goes up, but what you can buy with it goes down. That little gap? That's how the real value of the government's debt gets slowly inflated away. You know, this isn't some crazy new invention. The U.S. actually used a very similar strategy to deal with its massive debt after World War II. But today, the playbook is a lot more sophisticated. It's been upgraded for the modern financial system.
This modern strategy really comes down to three key pillars. First, you have to create a forced market for your debt. Second, you need to control how inflation is actually measured. And third, you make sure the central bank is on your team, helping to fund your spending. Let's break each of those down.
All right, tool number one, captive buyers. Now, in a normal market, if you tried to borrow trillions of dollars, you'd have to offer really high interest rates to attract buyers. But what if you don't have to? Financial regulations basically force banks, pension funds, and insurance companies to hold huge amounts of U.S. government bonds as a safe asset. They're not buying them because it's a great deal. They're buying them because they have to. This creates this constant, artificial demand that keeps the government's borrowing costs way lower than they should be. Next up, you have to control the yardstick for inflation itself.
Government payments for things like Social Security are tied to the official inflation number, the CPI. But over the years, the way the CPI is calculated has been changed. Things like substitution bias get factored in. That's the assumption that if steak gets expensive, you'll just buy hamburger instead. Or hedonic adjustments, which lower the price of a new iPhone because it's better than the old one. The end result is that the official number often feels lower than the inflation we experience every day. And a lower CPI means the government pays out less.
And the last piece of the puzzle is something called fiscal dominance. This is basically when the government's need to borrow money becomes more important than the Federal Reserve's job to fight inflation. When the Treasury needs to sell trillions in new bonds and there aren't enough buyers, the Fed can step in and essentially print new money to buy those bonds. You've heard of it as quantitative easing. It keeps interest rates low for the government for sure, but it also pumps more money into the system, which fuels inflation. So we have this whole complex playbook running behind the scenes, but what's the actual cost? Who pays the price for this silent default? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Anyone who earns a wage or tries to save money the old-fashioned way.
This all ties back to an old idea from the 1700s called the Cantillon effect. It basically says that when new money gets printed, it doesn't spread out evenly. It gets injected into the top of the system through the big banks and financial institutions. The people who get it first use it to buy assets like stocks and real estate, which pushes their prices way up. By the time that money finally trickles down to the rest of us in the form of higher wages, the prices of everything we need to buy have already gone up. This is that K-shaped recovery you hear about. Asset owners get richer while wage earners feel like they're falling behind. And this brings us to a really stark conclusion. The good, solid advice our parents gave us, work hard, save your money in the bank, buy some safe government bonds, that strategy just doesn't work anymore. In an environment of financial repression, holding cash or low-yield bonds is a guaranteed way to lose purchasing power year after year. The source material really doesn't pull any punches here. It argues that this fundamental idea that you could patiently save and build your way to a comfortable life, that promise has been broken by this new financial reality. To even keep up, you're now forced to take on more and more risk in the market.
So this leaves us with the one question that really matters. In a system that is, by design, slowly devaluing its own currency to get out of debt, what does financial safety even mean anymore? As the old rules of money break down, it really forces every single one of us to think differently about how we protect our own future.